A Swedish king once signed a written order giving prison guards permission to poison the previous king. There was a condition attached. They were to do it only if someone tried to break the prisoner out. The prisoner was the former king's own brother. His name was Erik, and by the time that order existed, he had spent years insisting the people around him were plotting to kill him. Everyone at court had a word for that. The word was madness. This is the problem with Erik XIV of Sweden. We remember him as the Mad King, the one who saw assassins in every shadow and executed men over horoscopes. Most of that is accurate. But the thing that got him called insane, the certainty that his own family wanted him dead and off the throne, turned out to be a correct forecast, and he is the one who made it come true. Erik spent his reign acting on that fear, and every move he made to escape it built the outcome closer. He was afraid they would take his crown and kill him, so he taught them how. Start earlier though, because the tragedy only works if you understand what was lost. Erik was born in December 1533 in Stockholm, inside a castle called Kronor that no longer exists. His father was Gustav Vasa, the man who essentially invented modern Sweden, hauled it out of a union with Denmark and made himself its first hereditary king. Erik was the eldest son, the designated heir from boyhood, the chosen one in the most literal dynastic sense, and here is the part that gets flattened out of the Mad King story. He was brilliant. Not brilliant in the flattering way biographers hand out to every dead monarch. Genuinely, unusually educated. He spoke several foreign languages with real competence. He read history and understood it. He studied mathematics and military science, the second one a lifelong obsession. He played the lute and composed his own pieces. One of his tutors was a French Calvinist scholar named Dionysius Burrus, and Burrus matters a great deal later, so hold on to him. The short version is that Sweden's heir was one of the best educated princes in Europe, and everyone knew it. His relationship with his father curdled early, and it curdled over exactly the instinct that would define him. Gustav Vasa wanted his heir married sensibly, at home, to a good Swedish noble family. Erik wanted a princess or nothing, and he would not let it go, and the two of them fought about it for years. You can see the whole man in that argument already. The reach for prestige, the refusal to bend, the certainty that he was owed the biggest prize on the table. There was an incident in December 1559, before he was king, that people at the time called the Vadstena Rumble. During a wedding party for one of his sisters, a visiting count got caught in the bedroom of another sister, Cecilia, in a situation nobody could dress up as innocent. Erik, standing in as regent, took the blame from his father for handling it clumsily and letting it become a public scandal. What he learned from the humiliation was not discretion, it was control. Once he was king, he watched his unmarried sisters like a warden, and after he caught Cecilia hosting a late-night party, he handed down fresh rules for how the whole court would conduct itself. A man who answers embarrassment by tightening every screw around the people nearest to him. Hold that shape too, it keeps coming back. Before the crown there was the courtship, and the courtship tells you how his mind worked. Erik wanted a great foreign marriage, not a sensible Swedish match, which is what Gustav wanted, but a queen. His main target for years was Elizabeth I of England. He wrote her letters in Latin, sent his half-brother John across the sea to argue the case in person, and mailed her a portrait of himself so she could see what she was turning down. That portrait sat in England for centuries before it came home. It hangs at Gripsholm Castle now. Elizabeth did to Erik what Elizabeth did to everyone. She enjoyed the attention, kept the correspondence going, and had no intention of marrying him. In 1560, Erik decided he would settle it in person and sail to England to press his suit face to face. His fleet put out and a storm tore it apart. While he was regrouping, word came that his father had died. The trip was finished. He went home to be king instead, still unmarried, having been strung along for years by a woman who was never going to say yes. He tried for Mary, Queen of Scots too, declined. He sent a formal deputation after Renata of Lorraine, chased Anna of Saxony and Christine of Hesse. The sources are blunt that he wrecked his own chances with several of these women through sheer fickleness, changing his mind mid-negotiation, insulting the process. A man who wants desperately to be chosen by a queen and cannot stop sabotaging the choosing. Remember that shape as well. Gustav Vasa died on the 29th of September 1560. Erik took the throne and was crowned the next summer at Uppsala Cathedral, the first coronation of a hereditary Swedish king. He did the usual new king business, invented the Swedish titles of Count and Baron, and handed out land to bind the great families to the crown. Skip the guest list. The one act from those first months that actually detonates later is quieter and meaner. At a meeting of the Riksdag at Arboga in April 1561, Erik cut down the powers his half-brothers held inside their own duchies. John and Charles, the two younger Vasa sons, suddenly found their authority clipped. They did not forget it. John in particular kept running his own expansionist Livonian schemes in open breach of the Arboga terms, which only sharpened the bad blood. That grievance is the fuse, and it burns for 7 years. Now the war, and I am not going to pretend the naval bookkeeping is the thrilling part, because it is not. What matters is that Erik was good at it. His father had been content to rule a self-contained Sweden and leave the neighbours alone. Erik wanted the Baltic. When the old Livonian order fell apart in 1561, he pushed Swedish influence into Estonia, took Reval under Swedish protection, and shouldered Denmark out of the way. That was the opening move in Sweden's long climb toward becoming a great power, and it was Erik's idea, not something he inherited. The Northern 7 Years' War followed. From 1563 to 1570, Sweden against a coalition of Denmark, Norway, the trading city of Lübeck, and the Poles. It ground on for years and left both sides broke, taxes climbing, ordinary people paying for royal ambition the way they always do. Erik ran it well. He beat back most of what Denmark threw at him. There was a fight off the island of Öland, and another the next year, and an action in July 1566 that ended with something no admiral planned. 2 days after the guns went quiet, a storm caught 14 Allied ships anchored near Visby and put roughly 5,900 men on the seafloor. Nobody won that one. The weather did. The war finally closed with the Peace of Stettin in December 1570, by which point Erik himself was already gone from power. The historians who study this period give Erik real credit as a wartime organiser, and they earn that assessment honestly. He could hold a kingdom together against a coalition. He could not hold himself together at all. Those two lines run through the 1560s side by side, one rising, one falling, and they cross in 1567. To understand the fall, you have to meet the man Erik trusted most, because it was not a relative and not a noble, it was a commoner named Jöran Persson. Persson had come within a breath of execution under Gustav Vasa and clawed his way back into power, and under Erik he became chief counsellor and head of the king's network of spies. He despised the old aristocracy. He despised Duke John in particular, and he built Erik a working apparatus for going after both of them. If you want one person who took the king's suspicion and gave it procedure and paperwork, it is Persson. He supplied the machinery. Erik supplied the fear. Somewhere around 1563, the suspicion stopped being ordinary court wariness and turned into something clinical. Modern sources reach for the word schizophrenia, describing a man swinging between violent frenzy and total collapse, rage 1 hour and weeping repentance the next. I'm not going to diagnose a man dead 4.5 centuries ago across a language barrier. What the record hands us is behaviour, and the behaviour gets worse every year, and by 1567 it is out of anyone's control. The paranoia reached his own blood before it reached anyone else. His half-brother John, Duke of Finland, had gone off and run his own foreign policy, married into the Polish royal house, and cut an alliance Erik had never approved. In 1563 Erik had him arrested for it, and John's Polish wife, Catherine Jagiellon, chose to be locked up alongside her husband rather than abandon him. Erik kept his brother imprisoned for 4 years and released him in 1567. Sit with that timing, because it turns out to matter more than almost anything else here. Erik let out the brother who, inside of about a year, would imprison him for the rest of his life. His deepest suspicion, though, settled on one family, the Stures. This was old, high nobility, and its head, Svante Stenson Sture, was married into the Vasa line himself. Erik had no legitimate heir. He had a stack of illegitimate children and a mistress he was falling in love with, but no legal successor, and he had talked himself into the belief that the Stures, specifically Svante's son Nils, meant to take his crown. There was a horoscope in the mix. An astrologer had apparently warned him that a fair-haired man would supplant him, and Erik, who had studied astrology seriously as a boy, took it dead seriously as a king. He looked at the blonde Nils Sture and saw the man in the reading. He had already moved against the family once in 1566, charging Nils with treason and then flinching, commuting the death sentence and shipping him off to Lorraine on a marriage errand instead. When Nils came back in 1567, Erik had changed course entirely and decided to marry Karin, and the old suspicion came roaring back with him, sharper than before. That flinch a year earlier is the whole tragedy in miniature. Erik's cruelty came in waves, and in the troughs between them he drowned in guilt. In the days before the killings, he wrote Svante Sture a letter of reconciliation, went to see him in person, dropped to his knees in front of the man and begged forgiveness. Actually knelt. And then, a few hours later, some fresh scrap of news reached him, and the whole thing flipped, and the guilt burned off and left nothing but the rage. On the 24th of May, 1567, at Uppsala Castle it happened. The Sture men and several others were being held on charges of conspiracy, and some already carried death sentences. Erik went in, and Erik personally stabbed Nils Sture to death, not ordered from a distance, did it with his own hand. By the time it was over, 6 men were dead, killed by the king and his guards, Svante Sture and 2 of his sons among them. One of the others was Dionysius Burrus, the old tutor. The French scholar who had built Erik's famous education tried to step in and calm the king outside the castle, tried to talk him down off the ledge, and Erik had him killed too. The research calls Burrus an unintended casualty, and that might be the most chilling line in the whole account, because it means that by that afternoon Erik was no longer aiming, he was just killing, and the man who had shaped his mind as a boy got swept into it like furniture in the path of a flood. Then the king ran, into the forest outside Uppsala, alone, in the middle of whatever was happening inside his skull. His own men found him days later dressed in peasant clothes, still not right, still talking to nobody. For a stretch after the massacre, the King of Sweden was missing in the woods in disguise. When he surfaced back into himself, he did what he always did after the rage, the grief, and the reaching for absolution, and he actually reached some kind of settlement with the murdered men's families, which changes nothing for the dead, but it tells you the loop never broke. Fear, violence, collapse, remorse, and around again. His grip slipped so badly that he was briefly set aside from power, before he clawed his way back. He ran that circle until it killed him. There is one genuinely tender thread running through all of this, and it belongs to a woman named Karin Månsdotter. She was nobody by the measure of the court, daughter of a soldier who ended up a prison guard, born poor in Stockholm, orphaned young. She first turns up in the records at 14, working for a court musician, and his wife who ran a guest house where royal guests came to drink. A serving girl at an inn. There is a pretty legend that Erik first spotted her selling nuts, or oranges in some tellings, in a Stockholm square, and lost his heart on sight. Lovely story. Not what happened. She was a tavern servant. They met at the very start of 1565. She moved into the castle, and by every account he loved her in a way he loved nothing and no one else. Before her there had been others, and the children arrived long before any wedding. With a mistress named Agda Persdotter, he had 3 daughters, and he named them out of his classical schooling, Virginia and Constantia, and Lucretia, Roman names for a soldier king's out-of-wedlock girls. A small thing, but it tells you the learning never left him even as the rest of him came apart. Karin gave him a daughter, Sigrid, in 1566, before there was any marriage at all, and then Erik did the thing that scandalised the entire nobility more than the murders had, in a way. He married her. Quietly at first, then in public, and the sources cannot agree on the dates, so I'm not going to pretend to pick one. Then he had her crowned. Karin Månsdotter, the innkeeper's serving girl, became the first commoner ever crowned Queen of Sweden. Their infant son Gustav was named Prince Royal at the coronation. The great families who had just watched this king butcher their own kind at Uppsala now had to bow to a peasant queen. You can guess how that landed. And here is what moves me about her. She stayed. When it all fell in, when he was hauled from castle to castle as a prisoner, Karin stayed beside him as long as they let her. She had nothing to gain from a broken, deposed man. She stayed anyway. Because it fell in fast. Early in 1568, Erik seemed to surface, to get his reason back for a moment, and he tried to reconcile with John on one condition, that John recognised the marriage to Karin. too late for conditions. By that autumn, John and Charles had settled on the story that the king was insane and unfit, and they raised a rebellion, the two clipped-winged dukes from Arboga finally collecting on a 7-year-old debt. They wrapped it in the language of rescue. The king was a tyrant. He had trampled the nobility. He was steering the country into ruin, all of which had the convenience of being partly true. The revolt began in July 1568 and spread like a grease fire. Erik actually won a battle at Botkyrka, and then, in the manner that had become his signature, did nothing with the win. By the middle of September, the ducal army stood outside Stockholm, and on the 28th and 29th the city opened its gates to the rebels. John took his brother prisoner and seized power on the 30th of September 1568. In January, the Riksdag made it law and formally deposed him. The brother Erik had once kept in a cell for 4 years now held the cell key and would not be letting go. Jöran Persson, the Spymaster, the man of forms and files, was thrown to the wolves first. John had a personal score to settle there, having done time in Erik's prisons himself, and he never forgave Persson for any of it. Persson was broken on the wheel, tortured, and beheaded that September. The scaffolding of the regime came down before the king it had served. What followed was 9 years of one very specific problem. A deposed king is more dangerous alive than dead, and John understood that perfectly, because Erik still had loyalists, and 3 separate times over those years someone tried to break him out or rise in his name, so John kept him moving. Turku, out across the water in Finland, then Kastelholm, then Gripsholm, then Västerås. The logic of the shuffle was cold and practical. A prisoner who never stays put is a prisoner nobody can plan a rescue around. Karin went with him at first, until they were pulled apart and she was sent back to Finland while he was moved on to Västerås. In December 1574, with yet another rescue attempt in the wind, John suddenly had Erik dragged out of Västerås and delivered to Örbyhus Castle, and it was inside Örbyhus, on the 26th of February 1577, that Erik XIV died, 43 years old after 9 years behind stone. The story everybody tells is the pea soup. That tradition comes down from a historian named Johannes Messenius, who has it that Erik's last meal was a bowl of pea soup with poison stirred through it. It is a good grim picture, and I cannot swear the bowl is literally true, but the thing sitting under the legend is true, and it is worse than any bowl of soup because there is a document. John III and a nobleman named Bengt Bengtsson Gilter put their names to a written authorization telling Erik's guards to poison him if a rescue ever came close. That is not a rumour passed down by playwrights. That is a signed order, and it means the Crown had decided on paper that the former king should die rather than walk free. And the Arsenic agrees. Erik's body was dug up and examined, and an examination in 1958 concluded he had most likely died of arsenic poisoning. And later forensic work on his remains found the same answer, lethal amounts of it in what was left of him. So run the whole thing back. The man everyone called paranoid spent his final years convinced his brother's people were going to poison him in his cell. His brother's people had signed permission to do exactly that. They appear to have used it. In that room, the delusion and the fact finally met each other. That is the cruel symmetry of Erik XIV, and it is why he deserves more than the Mad King cartoon we hang on him. He was not wrong that his family wanted him gone. He was wrong to believe he could stab and imprison and terrorise his way to safety. Every violent thing he did to guard his crown, the Stures, the Horoscope, the 4 years he stole from John, the suspicion he aimed at everyone with noble blood, handed his brothers the grievance and the excuse they needed to take the whole thing. He feared betrayal, and then built it with his own hands. He feared the fair-haired man in the prophecy, and turned every other noble in the country into an enemy who wished he were dead. His paranoia was an engine, and what it manufactured was its own proof. Here is where he came to rest. Erik was buried at Västerås Cathedral in April 1577 under the cathedral floor. Then in 1797, more than 200 years later, someone moved him up into something grand, a sarcophagus of white Carrara marble on a base of reddish sandstone from Öland. That tomb had originally been commissioned by a much later king, Gustav III, for his own body, and he gave it away to hold Erik instead. On top of it sit a crown and an arrow. Both were taken from the funeral monument of John III over in Uppsala Cathedral. So the murdered king lies for eternity beneath a crown pried off the tomb of the brother who signed the order to poison him. Somebody in Sweden arranged that deliberately and left it standing, and you can walk in and look at it today. The afterlife of Erik is mostly literary now. August Strindberg wrote a play about him in 1899, the closing panel of his Vasa trilogy, and read Erik as a man built from bits and scraps, vacillating, disintegrating, which says at least as much about Strindberg as it does about the king. That play became a film in 1954. Mika Waltari built a 1942 novel around Erik and Karin and leaned hard into the love story. Modern Swedish historians have grown more careful than the old romantics who either sainted him or damned him outright. They point at what usually gets buried under the word mad, that he drove Sweden into the Baltic and set up its rise, that he ran a coalition war for years without losing his country, that a capable king lived somewhere inside the wreckage. They also refuse to excuse the men he killed. Both things are allowed to stand, a gifted ruler and a murderer under one crown, dead in one cell.